Welcome back. Today we're going to be discussing Chapter 11, which is Scene Size Up. Scene Size Up covers the first few seconds of a call. This is when you first arrive on scene, what's taking in whatever you see initially, and making some quick decisions on how the call needs to run based off of that. This is a relatively short chapter, especially compared to the chapters that we have been doing recently with airway management and pathophysiology and all that stuff. So it is relatively quick, but it is stuff that is very critical for us to know because it's going to set the tone for the rest of the call and is really going to set you up for either success or failure, whether you do this right or not. All right, so let's dive right in. So the things that you're looking for in a scene size up. If you look at your patient assessment sheets, either your medical patient assessment or your trauma patient assessment on your New York State practical sheets, the first few items on there are the scene size up. It's the first, I believe, 5 items on there, and to the side it says scene size up. So like I said, this is the first few seconds of a call, what we're going to be doing. So first thing that we want to be doing is ensuring scene safety. We talked about this a little bit in the well-being of the EMT, but scene safety is the most important thing that we need to first assure when we get there and make sure that we continue scene safety. Scene safety extends to you, your partner, bystanders, and the patient. Because typically, if any of those people are compromised with your scene safety, you're probably going to be compromised with your scene safety. The most important people that you need to worry about for scene safety are you and your partner. So above all else, make sure that you are safe and then your partner is safe. Because if you or your partner are not safe anymore, you get hurt, then not only can you not provide patient care to the original patient, but then you become a patient yourself. So scene safety is priority 1 for us, and that's both initially and throughout the rest of the call. You always have to be reevaluating, are you safe? The next step we take is utilizing our proper PPE. When we arrive on scene, we know we're going to be contacting the patient, so you always put your gloves on before you contact your patient. Pretty much everything we do with patients is us touching them with our hands, so you want some sort of barrier there. This is also where you might be able to see clues that you might need other forms of PPE, whether that be a N95 mask or eye protection or maybe even a gown. This is where we get our first view of the scene and we might know what type of body substance issues we might be facing on the scene. This is also where you want to be putting on personal protective equipment. That kind of goes, I might say personal protective clothing. This goes beyond your standard PPE. Say you are on the scene of a car accident and you're going to be providing patient care in the car. You want to be wearing some sort of protective clothing to keep yourself safe from any substances in the car, such as broken glass or some bent metal, anything like that. So this is where we a lot of times have firefighting turnout gear. If you are a firefighter, you're going to be wearing that during a car accident scene. If you do not have the proper equipment on to be in that environment, please do not enter that environment. We have other people who will be able to do that for you. The next thing that we want to be looking at is seeing what the mechanism of injury is. So the mechanism of injury is, how was this patient injured? So this is only goes for people who have traumatic injuries, but if it's someone who was in a car crash, your mechanism of injury would be the car crash. If it was someone who fell, your mechanism of injury would be the fall. If it's someone who was assaulted, you need to find out from what, and that would be your mechanism of injury. So knowing the general thing of what hurt the patient, it's going to start you thinking in the right direction of what type of injuries this patient might have, what you need to be looking for. We're going to talk about that a lot more in a little bit. If it's not a traumatic call and it's more of a medical call, we call it the nature of the patient's illness. So this is where you find out, is this a breathing problem? Is this a chest pain problem? Is this someone who is dealing with an allergic reaction? The reason why we want to be doing either mechanism of injury or the nature of illness is so that we can start thinking down the right path of how to treat the patient. Now, this is not gaining tunnel vision and thinking, oh, this is the only thing that I'm going to be doing to the patient, because a patient can't have more than one thing happen to them. But this is going to help you formulate your questions, help direct where you want the call to go. For example, if you have someone who has an allergic reaction, you want to find out more quickly what are they allergic to, make sure that that is done. If it's a bee sting, you want to make sure they're not around a beehive anymore. And you want to find out if they have an EpiPen on them sooner rather than later, versus if you have someone who has a chest pain complaint, you knowing that if they have an EpiPen or not is much less of a concern at that point. It's still something we're going to cover, but we're going to be covering it a lot further down along the line, rather than someone who is experiencing an issue right then and might need the EpiPen immediately. The next thing we need to determine is how many patients we have. If you have, say, a car accident and you have 3 people who are injured, you then have 3 patients. This becomes an issue because you can't transport 3 patients, so you need to find out how injured people are so that you can get the proper number of ambulances coming to you. But also, you don't want to be neglecting care of patients. You don't want to come up to your first patient and just be treating them exclusively and have no idea what the other patient's conditions are. So needing to know how many patients you have to treat is huge so that you don't end up ignoring a patient. Most of our calls, we only have 1 patient, so it's a very easy determinant. But there are some special calls where we will have more than 1 patient, and you need to be able to handle that. And that leads us into deciding what additional resources may be necessary. So if you have 4 or 5 patients, you can only transport 1, so you need to start rolling other ambulances towards you. If you have a car accident, you are going to want the fire department on scene to secure any hazards in the car and to possibly cut someone out of the car. You want police on scene to stop traffic so that your scene remains safe. A lot of times dispatch will help take care of this before you get there. Dispatch is usually pretty good, so if they know that there's a car accident, they will dispatch fire, police, and you in the ambulance. But there are a lot of times where dispatch doesn't know things that are happening in the call. For example, if you have a patient who broke their leg and they're in the basement, usually you and your partner should be able to handle that call. But if the patient is 500 pounds, then you and your partner can't carry that patient upstairs. So you're going to need to recognize, I need more help. Usually that comes in the help of the fire department will help you lift. So it's things like that that we need to be thinking about ahead of time, because it takes time to get resources to you. So that's why we want to be thinking about this as one of the first things when we arrive on scene is, do I need anyone else to come help me treat this patient effectively? So these are all the first steps of a call. If you look at your practical sheets, these are the first things on those sheets. In reality, all of this should happen in the first about 5 seconds of you pulling up on scene. You should be able to see the scene and you should be able to knock all these things off within a few seconds. This is very important stuff. That's why we put it before we even do our patient assessment, because this will help guide your call from start to finish. So if you screw something up here, it's going to be detrimental to the call down the line. And if you succeed in all these things, it should help you have a nice, smooth call going forward. So the nature of our work is that it's ever changing. That's what draws a lot of people to us. We never have this exact same day in the office like a lot of people do. So it is easy to get complacent when you have routine types of calls. If you have the old woman in your district that falls once a week and you go and you pick her up once a week, it is easy to get complacent. Keep in mind that the only predictable thing about our job is that it is unpredictable. Being complacent is when people get hurt. So keep in mind that scenes are ever changing. Just because it's a routine call that you think you've done many times before doesn't mean that you will remain safe throughout the call. Things will always change on you. So when we're looking at motor vehicle accidents, there's a lot of scene safety factors that go into the first few steps when we pull up on scene, and a lot more than most calls have for scene safety. One of which is our other emergency responders. When you're there, you get out, you need to make sure that there's not another fire truck or another ambulance or another police car that's trying to get around the scene, because they are trying to navigate through a very cluttered scene. They might not see you getting out of your vehicle or walking around. So make sure that you are aware of movement around you. Hopefully, routine traffic has been stopped at that point, but that's another big area to watch out for, is if routine traffic is going around the scene and you're walking around, you have to be very cognizant of where they are, mainly because the public is going to be looking at the scene and not at you. We call them rubberneckers because they are not looking in front of them, they are looking at the cool car accident that they're passing, and they will keep their eyes on that for 15 seconds as they're driving by. So they are not looking in front or to the side of where they're driving. They're just looking at the cool crash that they are passing. So you need to be very aware of where they are. Another thing you need to look out for is if the car took out a telephone pole and there's wires on the ground. Wires on the ground oftentimes are energized. So be on the lookout for either a pole on the ground, or if you notice that's nighttime and there's no street lights on and no house lights on, that there's probably a power outage somewhere. It's probably coming from your scene. Also, you need to look for any signs of a vehicle that might catch on fire. So if you see smoke coming out of the vehicle, be very mindful of that, because a vehicle fire will take off in seconds. And if you don't have the proper protective clothing on, then you're going to be in serious danger of your own safety if you're near that vehicle. So when you're pulling up to the scene, take a look for anything that might give you a hint that the scene might not be safe. Gas on the ground is a big safety issue. So if you pull up and you see that there's a big puddle around the car, be very wary of approaching that vehicle. Again, let the fire department, who has the proper clothing and proper equipment, do that for you. Look for anyone who might be outside of the vehicle, whether that's them being ejected from the vehicle or them just got out of the vehicle when they crashed and they're walking around or sitting down on the road. Don't be fixated on the car that crashed, because there might be other people around you, and you don't want to do what the public does and be fixated on one object and not see where you're actually driving. So that goes hand in hand with making sure that you're watching out for anyone who's walking along the side of the road. People tend to forget that it is a road that they're in and that you're going to be driving down it. So whether that's bystanders who are fixated on the crash and they can be walking or running towards the crash, or it's other emergency responders who aren't watching their surroundings, or it's the victims themselves who are walking around because they're a little dazed. When you pull up on scene, if there's someone there in front of you, try to follow their directions. Usually they have a plan as to where they want the ambulance or whatever vehicle you're in. So if you see a police officer or a firefighter gesturing to you, try to first see it and then follow those instructions. That way you get to follow the plan of whatever the incident commander wants. Again, when you arrive on the scene, make sure that you find the incident commander and that you get the instructions from them. They should have a plan as to what you should be doing. If you're the first on the scene, that makes you the incident commander until someone else can relieve you of it. So that's something you have to be thinking about too, which we will talk about near the end of class, is how to manage a scene if you are the first one there. But if you're not the first one there, make sure you follow the incident commander's requests. Make sure that you have the appropriate protective apparel. If you're operating on a highway, you need to have a reflective yellow vest on at bare minimum. And there might be other types of equipment that you use, especially if you are a dual role. If you are a firefighter and an EMT, and you might be operating inside of the vehicle, make sure that you have your bunker gear on. So any car accident will have a danger zone. Some of them are small, some of them are very large. It depends on what you see around the vehicle. If you have gas that's leaking out of the vehicle, your danger zone is going to be relatively large. You want to be at least 100 feet away from the car and wherever the fuel has run to, because if that ignites, it can cause a lot of safety issues anywhere near you. So that's why we establish about 100 feet around when there's fuel spilled. If there is no fuel spilled, stay around 50 feet away from the vehicle. And that's because vehicles that have been in collisions are unpredictable. There are a lot of things that are pressurized in vehicles, a lot of big springs in vehicles, and those can sometimes randomly explode after a vehicle has been in a collision. So you have to be very mindful of that and keep your distance away from the danger zone. That being said, if it's a minor fender bender and there's just a little bit of damage to the rear fender of a vehicle, use your judgment. Usually you can safely approach it. But this is something that comes with time and experience as to knowing what vehicles are safe to approach or not. When a vehicle's on fire, again, follow the 100 feet rule in all directions. And when there are wires down that are energized are very unpredictable, and sometimes you might think they're dead, but then they become re-energized because no one's actually shut it off. So try to stay one telephone pole away from the pole that's been broken. So if you have a broken pole, have a good pole and then go one beyond that. That way wires shouldn't come back at you. And if you ever see a hazardous material involved, follow your emergency response guidebook. This was covered heavily in your guys' hazmat class. So crime scenes and acts of violence. Whenever we arrive on scene, we want to evaluate the level of threat of violence. I can tell you right now, the level of threat will never be zero. It doesn't matter what type of call, it will never be zero. It might be very low, but it's never zero. So we need to be looking for clues to help us determine how much of a level of threat we might have. So one thing that we look for is if you walk up and you hear fighting or loud voices happening, that will very easily turn towards you when you arrive on scene. So if you hear that, be very wary, probably back off and call for police. If you see weapons laying around, take that in consideration with the rest of the scene. There's a lot of people who own guns who have guns stored in their house and they don't intend on using them. So someone, just because they have a weapon in their house, doesn't mean it's going to be used, and especially used against you. But take that into account of what's going on with the patient. If the patient has altered mentation or the patient is already combative, then that's something that we have to take much more seriously than a routine call where someone might be having chest pain. They call for you and just they have their gun locked up in a safe near them. So take that subjectively and take the other clues of the call into account when you see weapons on scene. You can usually remove weapons pretty easily. A big one is like kitchen knives that are around. You can usually very discreetly move a kitchen knife so that you are between the patient and the knife, so it's not easy for them to access. But again, use your common sense and good judgment and the all-around surroundings of the call when it comes to seeing weapons. If you see any signs of intoxication or any type of drug use, those types of people will be more unpredictable. They are more prone to being combative and being violent with us. So anything that can alter your mind is something that we want to be taking acts of violence more seriously towards us. Also, loud, threatening voices is something to look for, but we also look for unusually silent voices. This is someone who might be planning an attack and they want to ambush you when you're walking up onto the scene. Or this is someone who is contemplating a plan to hurt you. So knowing someone that is being unusually silent could be a clue for you to be more on your guard for your own personal safety. And then having knowledge of prior violence towards EMS, fire, or police can go a long way. A lot of times if someone is violent towards us, we can get their residence tagged with the 911 center so that when we get dispatched, they can warn us that they've had previous issues with first responders. So knowing that someone has a history of it doesn't mean that it will happen every time, but you have to be much more suspicious of it, and feel free, if they have a history of violence, to wait for police. There was one patient that I had in the city of Syracuse that he would call relatively routinely. He had jaw cancer and he'd have jaw pain. There was one night that he was irrationally mad at me, and he ended up grabbing a shotgun and threatened to shoot me with it, which I backed off immediately. We called for police. But from then on, I refused to go to that house without police being dispatched first. There was one time he called, and it was a very busy time for police, and they thought it was stupid I was requesting them for jaw pain. So I waited for over an hour, a couple blocks away from the call, for the police to get there and make sure that the scene was safe for me before I went into that scene, because my prior knowledge of that patient told me that it was not safe for me to go to. So, whereas, like I said, no call will have zero possibility of a safety hazard, there are some calls that have elevated chances of safety hazards. So someone who is called for calls when they are on drugs or alcohol and they have altered mentation, like we just talked about, that's something where we have to raise our suspicion that we might have a scene safety issue. A motor vehicle accident will have elevated scene safety issues. Anytime that someone was assaulted, say it's a shooting or a stabbing, we're going to have elevated scene safety issues. So these are things that we need to take into account. If you remember back to the start of class when we talked about well-being of the EMT, in my opinion, one of the most dangerous calls that we go on aren't any of the ones that we've listed, but they're status checks, especially status checks late at night. So if someone calls 911 because they haven't heard from their family member or their friend in a couple of days and they can't reach them, then they call us and they expect us to go and check to make sure they're okay. So these are people that don't know that we're coming, and we might have to break into their house to make sure that they aren't dead or experiencing some sort of medical emergency inside. So not only do they not know we're coming, but we then forcefully enter their home without their knowledge. Most homeowners are not going to treat us very nicely when that happens. They're going to think someone's breaking into their house, and they might meet us with a lot of resistance because they don't know that we are the fire department or the ambulance or police. So these are calls that are very, very dangerous for us, that a lot of people just think, oh, it's another quick status check. We're going to make sure this person's still alive. It's no big deal. But these are calls that actually present a significant safety risk to us. So it's something you always have to keep in mind, even on the quote-unquote dumb calls we go to, because things can change very quickly and pose safety hazards to us very, very fast. So we need to be on our guard at all times and be prepared for any scene safety issues. So moving on into your standard precautions. There's a term in here, it's called BSI. It stands for Body Substance Isolation. So body substance isolation is using PPE to protect yourself. So we all remember what PPE is. That's your gloves, masks, gowns, eye protection, all that. And so PPE is used for BSI. So when we get to our patient assessments and your practical stations, your first step is to say BSI, or to actually take BSI precautions. So BSI precautions is utilizing PPE. So you'll walk into the station and you say, my BSI is on. So that means that you have PPE on. So moving on into the nature of the call. Like I said at the start of this lecture, your nature of your call is either going to be a mechanism of injury or a nature of illness. Sometimes it could be both. For example, if someone has a stroke, which then causes them to crash their car because they were driving while they had a stroke, you can have both of these at the same time. Typically, though, you'll have a mechanism of injury or a nature of illness. So as I said, your mechanism of injury is what caused your injury. The reason why this is important is because if we know what caused it, then we can predict what type of injuries you might see, and so we can be more cognizant of those areas. A lot of injuries are going to be internal, so we won't see outside forces that will tell us that something's hurt. So we need to know what might be happening on the inside. Not every injury is going to be a nice bone sticking out of the leg, so you can say, yeah, they have a broken bone. A lot of times it's going to be, well, they were in a car accident, their steering wheel hit their chest, so we might suspect that they have damage to their lungs. They might have something called a pneumothorax happening, which we'll cover in trauma. So that's why identifying and understanding your mechanism of injury is pretty important. That's also something that the hospital is going to want to know is how did this patient get hurt? Because they're looking for the same clues so they can guide their care. So here's a quick example of a scene you might run up onto. So seeing all this, what do you think happened just from looking at the car? Some things that point out to me is you see the roof like this, and you see the side of a car with some road rash. That means that this car probably rolled up onto its roof at one point. So it was hit so hard that it tipped over and rolled, and now it's upright again. Some other things I see is a lot of damage to this windshield right here. So this could have been from extrication from the fire department, or it could be caused by something hitting the windshield, either on the outside or the inside. The inside could have been a person. So you have to be thinking maybe the person's head hit the windshield. Another thing that we look for in motor vehicle collisions, especially in head-on collisions, we have what are called up and over and down and under. And this refers to the dash. Mainly if someone is not restrained with a seatbelt, they will either go up and over the dash and usually get ejected from the vehicle, and sometimes they'll go down and under the dash and they'll stay inside the vehicle, but they'll have a lot more injuries to their lower body. So up and over, you usually have a lot of injuries to your upper body because that's the part that's going to be hitting first. Down and under, you're usually going to have a lot of injuries to your lower body. Those are ones that we see with their legs broken in several places. You'll probably have some pelvis fractures. So it's important to know that it can go either way. And so where you find your patient will help you tell where they might be injured. Another thing you can look at in a motor vehicle crash is if airbags are deployed. If airbags are deployed, number one, you know that the incident was so bad that it hit those sensors, so they probably were going at a higher rate of speed. And also, that might protect them from hitting things such as the windshield or the dash, which is what airbags are supposed to do. So if they are not deployed, you might be suspecting that they hit their head off of something hard. If they were deployed, first, the accident might be a little bit more high velocity, but also they may have been a little bit more protected by the airbags. Right here is an example of a spidered windshield. So you can see it kind of circles around, and here's the focal point right here. So this is called spidering, and it kind of branches out like that too. Spidering is very consistent with someone's head hitting the windshield. So if you ever see spidering on a windshield, think that someone may have hit their head off the windshield. So you're going to be suspecting a massive trauma to the head. And sometimes we don't see it too much on the skin, but you'll have a good bleed happening inside of the skull, which can be a massive issue. So moving on with a few more motor vehicle accident things. We have several different types of motor vehicle collisions. We have rear end collisions. We have T-bones or side impact collisions. You have rollovers, and then you have head-on collisions. Here's some examples of some of those collisions. This one is a rear impact, so you can see all the damage happened here, and it looks like it may have hit that car in front of them too if they were stopped and rolled into another car. So here, since all the force is coming that way, the head will go that way, and we're thinking a lot of trauma to the neck because the head is going forward. Side impact, or T-bone, usually can cause a lot of problems if they're hit on the side that the patient is sitting on. So this is driver's side, so someone is sitting here, so a car came and hit him here. You see all the metal that's been pushed in towards the driver, so you're going to expect a lot of injuries, especially to the side of the driver. Here's a rollover collision. Rollovers are kind of wild cards. Actually, typically, if you're wearing your seatbelt nowadays, cars are relatively safe and are designed to roll over. So we aren't seeing as many injuries in modern cars nowadays, but it is something that you have to take into account that when you roll over, the car is impacted from pretty much every side, so you could have injuries to any side of the patient. Then here's a head-on collision. Head-on collisions are particularly bad because you have the velocity of your car traveling going against the velocity of another car traveling. So if you have 50 miles an hour versus 50 miles an hour, the impact speed will be 100 miles an hour. And as you can see, there is a lot of damage on the front end of both of these vehicles. So that will be double what, say, a rear end collision would be. Rear end collision, usually someone's stopped, and so if someone's going 50 miles an hour and rear ends you, it's a 50 mile an hour impact. Head on, it'd be a 100 mile an hour impact. So we are going to expect to see some significant injuries from head on collisions. So this is just some examples of what mechanism of injury can tell you. Just walking up, you see this, you can say, okay, it's a head on motor vehicle crash. Because of that, I'm going to be expecting a few more serious injuries because it's going to be a higher impact than, say, a rear view incident. So that's what we're kind of going for with mechanism of injury, is you're going to start to see the scenes and be able to predict what type of injuries you'll see so that you can focus on possibly treating some of those areas or have a higher level of suspicion for injuries in areas you can't see. Another type of motor vehicle crash that you can see are called rotational impact collisions. That's when a car is hit and then it kind of spins around in circles. We have to be worried about that because the initial impact will cause injuries, and then when you're spinning around, you might hit other vehicles, so that will change your direction of travel, which could cause other injuries. So when we're looking at falls are a very common injury that we're called to, especially in the elderly population. We start to be very concerned about things we can't see when we have falls from great height. So our rule of thumb is any adult that has a fall from more than 20 feet, or children who are under 15 years old. When they're over 15 years old, they're considered an adult. But children, if they fall from 2 to 3 times their height is usually the rule of thumb. So if they're 3 feet tall, a fall from 9 feet would count. But if they're 5 feet tall, it'd be a fall from 15 feet. So those are the types of falls that we're looking at for injuries are going to be traveling up to an area we might not see. So that's why we have to be very aware when someone falls from this height is, yes, you might have some broken legs, but you might have energy that traveled up and might be messing around with your internal organs. So be very wary of people who fall from great heights, and these types of people should be going to trauma centers. Also look at the surroundings of a fall. This person's at a construction site, so that will kind of help tell you why they fell sometimes. And maybe on a construction site, they hit some wood on the way down, or they landed someplace that they could have hurt them, more likely to land on a piece of wood. So some things that you're going to want to know when someone falls, and we're going to cover this again in our trauma section, but know how high they were when they fell. So if they fell from a great height, that's something that we need to know, as we just talked about. Know what type of surface they fell into. If you fall from 20 feet onto pavement, you're going to have a lot different injuries than if you fell 20 feet onto a bouncy house. So knowing what type of surface they fell onto is big, whether it's soft, medium, or hard. What part of the patient initially hit the surface. This comes into play a lot with the elderly population who fall from standing. If they land on their head, or if their head struck anything on the way down, that's going to be something of great concern. Then anything that interrupted the fall. So that would be someone fell from standing, but their head hit the toilet on the way down. We'd be a high suspicion of a head injury because they struck something on the way down, even if they landed on their butt. So injuries caused by penetrating trauma. So penetrating trauma is something that enters your body. and we usually classify them by how fast the object was going when it entered your body. We have low, medium, and high velocity penetrating traumas. So any low velocity trauma, that's usually something that's powered by a person. So a lot of ones that we see are stab injuries. They're usually only will damage the area that is right there. So if you get stabbed to the right chest, the injuries are isolated to the right chest. Be on the lookout that some people get stabbed multiple times, or whatever other penetrating trauma happened to them at low velocity might have happened multiple times. Just be on the lookout for that. Just because you see one injury doesn't mean you shouldn't be looking for the rest of the injuries. Medium velocity ones would be someone was shot with a handgun or a shotgun. Then high velocity injuries are usually rifle rounds. So we get worried with medium and high velocity penetrating trauma because not only do you have the damage from the bullet, so the projectile, so that's going to rip through your body and cause damage of where it went through, but you also have something called cavitation. And there was a YouTube video we showed in class showing what cavitation looks like. A cavitation is the pressure wave behind a bullet, and depending on the speed and size of the bullet, it can be 10 times the size of the original bullet path of pressure wave that just goes out and then back in, and it destroys everything in its path when it does that. So just because they have a small single shot to their body doesn't mean that there's not massive damage inside of the body. Some more types of injury that we are going to be looking at are blunt force traumas. So that is something that doesn't penetrate the skin, but it's some sort of blow that hits your body. A lot of these are like baseball bats or any sort of tool that you use to beat someone with, or just bare hands would cause blunt force trauma. Technically, most of the injuries that we get in car accidents are blunt force trauma injuries. So some issues that we find there is a lot of times if it doesn't break the skin, we don't see bleeding. It's hard to see the signs that someone was injured there, especially if they can't tell you that they were injured there. So that's where we have to start looking for different signs that there are injuries there, like discoloration of the skin or a number of other things that we're going to be covering in trauma. So that's where knowing your mechanism of injury definitely helps you, because we can't see what's going on the inside. So you have to think, what's the mechanism of injury? What should that cause normally in a patient? And that will help guide your treatment a little bit. If someone got hit in the head with a bat and their head feels fine, you should still be bringing them to the hospital, because you know someone gets hit in the head with a bat, you can probably have bleeding inside your brain, you're probably concussed, and that's something that you can't just let go, so they should be evaluated at the hospital. So that's an example of how mechanism of injury can help guide your treatment. Again, on the flip side, your nature of illness. So this is more for medical calls, and this is the overall reason why the patient called EMS. So if, like I said, if they're having difficulty breathing, your nature of illness is respiratory. If they're having an allergic reaction, your nature of illness is allergies. If they're having abdominal pain, your nature of illness is GI related. So this helps you guide what system you should probably be assessing a little bit more heavily. So your nature of illness, usually you get it from the patient. Sometimes it'll be from family members, especially for pediatric calls. You're going to get from family members or anyone who's mentally incapable of speaking with you. They'll probably tell you the nature of illness. And you can sometimes get clues from the scene. So if you're called for an unconscious person and you show up and you see that they have a bunch of insulin vials around, you can probably assume that they might be diabetic, and the diabetes is what's causing them to be unconscious. So that would be your nature of illness is diabetic related. So sometimes taking in clues from your scene and what your surroundings are telling you will help you determine the nature of illness, especially if a patient can't verbalize it to you, or if what the patient's verbalizing is not matching up with what you're finding. So that brings us to the number of patients and adequacy of resources. So like I said, you need to know how many patients you have to take care of. This is for multiple reasons. First off, you need to have other agencies started if you have multiple patients that you need transported. So you need to know how many ambulances are going to be there. And also, you need to make sure that you are treating everyone. Again, we're going to talk about this near the end of class about multiple casualty incidents and how to run a scene by yourself. But you don't want to be focusing on one patient with minor injuries when you have two other patients that you haven't looked at and they end up having major injuries. So you need to know how many patients are actually there. And that number can change. There's numerous times where I'm on, say, a car accident. I start out with only having one patient because only one person is injured, but then halfway through the call, the person in the other car is like, you know what, I'm starting to not feel too good because their adrenaline's wearing off and they're starting to feel their injuries. So then I end up with two patients halfway through the call. So this is a number that can change, and you have to understand that it might change. So going hand in hand with how many patients are present is make sure that you have all the resources you need. If you need another agency on your scene to help you with something, like law enforcement for traffic, or if the scene becomes unsafe, you want law enforcement there. The fire department can help you with lifting a patient if they're heavy. Sometimes you might need air medical, so if someone is having a massive trauma that they shouldn't be going by ground ambulance, you need to arrange for a helicopter to come. Having advanced life support show up, so a paramedic show up if the injuries are consistent with needing advanced care. Or if you can't access the patient because they're in some sort of odd environment or odd terrain, you might need technical rescue. If the patient is in a hazardous situation, you might need hazmat. So being able to see the scene and understand that you need other people to help you is critical, and we want to get that the extra resources started as soon as possible, because like I said at the start, resources take time to get to you. And any time you're waiting for a resource to get there that you can't provide patient care is time wasted. So we don't want to be finding this stuff out 10 minutes into the call. We want to be finding this stuff out as soon as we can, and we want to start the resources as soon as we can. You know, it's always okay to start resources and then cancel them later. So if you think you're going to need someone, start them and keep them coming until you prove that you do not need them. So moving on to some chapter review. Like I said, this is a relatively short chapter, but it is very important to understand the concepts of this stuff. And we're going to be drilling this into you guys for your patient assessments. So scene size up is the first part of your patient assessment process. That's why it's first on your sheets. It's important during the scene size up to determine what, if any, threats there may be to your own safety and to the safety of others on scene. It's also very important to first take your standard precautions, so your proper BSI precautions. Next, it is important to determine the nature of the call by identifying the mechanism of injury or the nature of the patient's illness. Finally, you have to take into account the number of patients and other factors at the scene to determine if you will need any additional help. Remember to determine that if any, or what, if any, threats there may be to your own safety and to the safety of others at the scene. And again, remember to take appropriate standard precautions. That can change as you find out more information, such as if you entered a house for a leg injury and you find out the patient has COVID, back out, put your N95 on, go back in. So that can change based off the information that you find out. Remember to determine the nature of the call by identifying the mechanism of injury or the nature of patient's illness. And remember to determine the number of patients and any additional resources necessary. So for each of these dangers, what actions must be taken to remain safe at a collision scene? So leaking gasoline, put distance. Toxic or hazardous material spill, put some distance. Vehicle on fire, put some distance. And down power lines, put some distance. Usually for anything that comes with danger, you want to put distance between you and the event. What are some common mechanism of injury patterns for the following situations? So head-on collisions, you might see injuries to the neck because you're lunging forward when you're hit. Same with the rear end collisions, you might see some injuries to the neck because of lunging forward when you're hit. And fall from a height, will probably see injuries to where they made contact to the ground. So you'll see a lot of broken bones to where they contacted the ground. You are called to the scene of a shooting at a fast food restaurant. En route, you plan your scene size up strategy. What actions do you anticipate taking on arrival? So when you arrive, you want to make sure the scene is safe for you. So you need to know that the shooter is subdued or not on the scene anymore. You want to make sure that you have gloves, probably a mask, and eye protection as well. Then you want to know how many people have been shot. So you need to find your number of patients, and then make sure you have the appropriate resources coming to you to treat those patients. So whether that's fire department to help you care for patients till ambulances get there, or multiple ambulances, and then PD to secure the scene. So that brings us to the end of this chapter. Again, relatively short one, but it is very important to know all this stuff. And we will be doing this a lot in some practical applications. If you go on calls with a fire department or ambulance or during your clinical ride time, start to think about this stuff when you're pulling up on scene. Go through this checklist in your head of how many patients are here. Do we need any extra resources? What's the nature of illness? What's our mechanism of injury? Make sure that your scene is safe and it stays safe. So start practicing this on every single medical call that you go on. And this should become second nature to you. And like I said, for real life application, this stuff takes about 5 to 10 seconds on most calls to determine. It's something that we kind of silently run through your head, but it is important that we run through all this and we do it very quickly and efficiently, because this is going to set you up for success for the rest of the call.